Hi, everybody. How are we doing tonight?
Good.
I want to welcome you all to the American Writers Museum. And I'm hearing from that sound that I believe we are now live on Zoom. So I want to welcome those of you who are here in the audience with us tonight and those of you who are online with us. So welcome, everybody. We're excited about tonight's program. This program is in partnership with the Off-Campus Writers Workshop, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary. Part of that celebration was the publication of this new book, Turning Points, which is a collection of work from some of the writers in this writers' workshop. And tonight's program is going to discuss the importance of a writers' workshop and how the community of writers work together. We have had hundreds of writers come through here for programs, and almost every one of them talks about in their writing process what their community is, who they work with, whether it be their editors, their friends, their family. There are very few writers who do not have a writers community that supports the work that they do. And so writers' workshops are an important part of that. And so we're excited to discuss the importance of it and how it helps writers get the job done. So we're excited about the program, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. So just a little bit of understanding about tonight's program. Our panelists are going to talk to each other about the process and about using a writer's workshop and its importance and significance. But along with that, they're open to questions that the audience might have. To facilitate that, we're going to ask members of the audience who are here with us. You'll see there's a mic stand in the back of the room. If you want to ask a question at any point, just walk over to the microphone that's going to be there. And when the panelists wave at you, go right ahead and ask your question into the microphone. If you are online on Zoom, there is a button that says Q&A. And so at any point, if you have a question for these panelists, just hit the Q&A button and type it into the Q&A, and we will read those questions out loud at the appropriate time. Okay? So folks at home, send us some questions. Folks in the room, think of some questions. And I'd like to now take a couple of minutes to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start on the far side down there, who's Tom Sundell, a fiction writer with over 21 published novels to date, including A Bloodline of Kings, which was named a finalist by the Independent Book Publishers Awards. Directly next to him is Ronit Bezalel, an award-winning documentarian. Voices of Cabrini, remaking Chicago's public housing, was in 1999, who splits her time between Chicago and Jerusalem. Della Leavitt is right here and is a historical writer currently revising Beyond Maxwell Street with support from the Newberry Library and the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. And Sarah Schwartz is a multi-genre writer who served as a former teacher and principal at Chicago Public Schools. Her most recent work, a middle grade novel called Game Over, Shrink Withers? Yep. Game Over, Shrink Withers. So welcome to our panelists, and give them a round of applause for being here with us tonight.
Okay.
I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Carrie, and I want to thank the American Writers Museum for giving the Off-Campus Writers Workshop the opportunity to introduce our organization, our all-volunteer organization that we call OCWW. The ones who completed this year the Turning Points anthology that was launched in June. OCWW began in 1946 with author Scott Turow's mother among the founding members. Since that time, the workshop has continuously served writers with weekly craft lectures from September through May. Last September, I must mention Fred Schaefer, former editor of Northwestern's tri-quarterly literary magazine, completed his 35th, yes, 35 years of consecutive lecture series with another well-researched topic, silence in fiction, illustrated by examples from British author Tessa Hadley. I think Fred single-handedly brings people to OCW year after year after year. Before the pandemic, the lectures were held in person at the Winnetka Community House. And when necessity mandated a Zoom format, it also brought the opportunity to expand our reach for both speakers and attendees beyond the Chicago area. Thanks to Linda Beyer, Paula McCroot, Tonya Coates, and Paco Aramburu, who recently assumed our president's position, they all stepped up to facilitate that technology. Now it's not unusual for up to 150 people from around the world to sign up for our weekly author sessions. In October, there were 168 people who signed up for Charles Baxter's exciting lecture. Jennifer Egan will appear next March in a Q&A about historical fiction. I can't say enough about the Herculean efforts by OCWW's Director of Programs, Susan Levi, to arrange outstanding speakers and plan the annual calendar. Our ongoing programs are the heart of our organization. In a few weeks, we do plan to go to a hybrid format with limited in-person sessions at the Winnetka Community House, simultaneously broadcasting over Zoom, something like we're trying here today at the American Writers Museum. The design and testing of this technology was accomplished by members Jason Levicki, Tonya Coates, and Karen Green. There are currently close to 300 OCWW members, although over 700 people get notifications of our weekly programs. Benefits for membership also include manuscript critiques by many of our speakers, an opportunity to join OCWW writing groups, the community that Carrie just referred to, part of the community he referred to. I co-coordinate the peer group formation with longstanding member Judy Panko-Reese, who also heads up our summer programs. She is a wonderful partner. And I must acknowledge the leadership of outgoing President Fred Fitzsimmons, whose vision led to expansion of OCWW offerings during his 5-year tenure. One of those expansions was the anthology project. On this evening's panel, we represent 4 of the 43 contributors to the Turning Points anthology. This project was conceived by OCWW board meeting member and author Renee James. It began in December 2019, aiming for an inclusive process where writers across a range of publication experience could contribute quality stories. An important first level of that process was working within assigned small groups before it went to the editorial work done by Renee James, Peter Hoppick, Tracy Forge Koppel, and Charles Dickinson. I know my story, Repeal, benefited from our small working group with talented writers Susan Bierman, Adrienne Hayward, Linda Beyer, and Susan Van Dusen. So the question today at this gathering, why every writer needs a writing workshop, I think it could be answered differently by writers and non-writers alike, at all levels of experience. I know Ronit, Sarah, Thomas, and I have very different backgrounds and experiences that brought us to become writers. So we'll have different answers and hope to hear from those in the audience with questions and those over on Zoom. So we're going to take a little time to introduce ourselves, our work, and identify where we currently are as a writer. And Sarah is going to start with that.
Thank you, Della. My name is Sarah Schwartz. I've spent most of my time in this city in the classrooms of about 9 schools altogether. 50% as teacher and 50% as principal. I loved them both. I'd still be there, but I needed to complete my bucket list. And my bucket list started at the age of 7. I didn't want to travel. I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to hold that book in my hand. That was really important to me. I knew it wasn't going to happen right away, But since I bought the library in Dubuque with my overdue fines, according to my mother, I own that library. I'm an Iowa girl. So when I got through reading every book in the children's section, and by that time I was 12, and there were no more books in the children's section for me to read. And I had to wait till I was 13, and it was a down year. So I said, one day I'll get even, I'll write that book. So it took me until I had retired from my education duties, and that happened between year 72 and year 73. And 10 years before that, I had seen a little ad in a paper or a comment somewhere, and it said there's a great writing group on the North Shore, and it's called OCWW, Off-Campus Writers Workshop. And I said, I'll join that one day. So when I retired, that's where I headed. And I found community. And that, to me, the OC, the C in OCWW stands for community, because it is amazing, the community of writers. Writing is a solitary profession. You're not together a lot. You're sitting maybe with a partner, a writing partner. I did a lot of writing at Barnes & Noble, a lot of writing in the library, a lot of writing at home, but it's a solitary profession. And what's really important about it is that you keep renewing your inspiration. You keep going and finding, training, learning, people who have skills that they can transfer to you, because you're never done learning how to write. You're never done. And I think that's what drew me to it, because I've always loved learning, and you're never done with this. I'd like to mention some of the earlier accomplishments of OCWW. This was the first one that was put out, the first anthology, called Overcoming. It has a dynamic cover, and the theme that year was overcoming. And then the next one that was done under Fred's jurisdiction, right, this was wonderful. I love the title, A Reason to Be Here, Tales from the Writers' Convention. These are creative ideas that were brought together as the result of community with the workshop. Chicago is a rich, rich resource. You could find something to do every minute of every day to enrich your bucket. We all got here by different roads today. Some of us came up the Dan Ryan, some of us came down the Eden, some of us came across from the west. We're all different, but we have a common passion and a common goal, and that is to make something meaningful for our lives and our understanding through the written word. And anything that we can do to increase that is helpful. The one image that I mentioned before that was very important to me was to be able to hold the book in my hand. This is the first book that I published. I published it at the beginning of the pandemic. This came out in May of 2020. This children's book came out just recently in October of 21. So at the worst of the worst, the ideas and the essays and the poetry that I've written before and the children's book that I always wanted to write have reached fruition in the time of Zoom land and virtual land. So I took my dream and I made it into reality with the help of a group like OCWW. I had one more thing. I mentioned it before, but to me, the C in OCWW has to do with community. And we are together because we have that passion that I mentioned. And the O is opportunity, because we are in this beautiful land of the Midwest on Lake Michigan. And I think that's about it. Ronit?
Thank you, Sarah. My journey is similar in a way. I started out 25 years ago as a documentary filmmaker. It was a way to tell stories and a way to fuse my social activism with art. And it's something that I love and I loved to do. But what's really interesting about me, as I would tell people, is I think in terms of words, not in terms of pictures necessarily. And I would always tell that to people, that my first love was writing. And when I was a kid, I used to keep journals and write all the time. And so while I knew that I loved filmmaking, in the back of my head, I always wanted to go back and write. That felt very natural to me. It's something that I wanted to do. I made 6 films. 2 films, documentary films, were about the Cabrini Green, the demolition of Cabrini Green and the displacement of residents. Those films were Voices of Cabrini and 70 Acres in Chicago, Cabrini Green. I finished with 70 Acres in Chicago. I think we finished in 2015. And I always told everyone that I'm retired from film. I want to do writing now. And people didn't believe me, or they said, well, why don't you make another film? But my heart wasn't in it. And I always believe that you have to go where your passion is, what draws you to whatever the source is, whatever the art form, whatever the creative impulse. And so for me, it was writing. And I knew Sue Levi. She was a friend of mine. We used to go mountain biking. And she told me about this OCWW, and I thought, okay, this sounds really fascinating to me. I want to go. And the thing that I instantly remember was the warmth, how warm people were and how welcoming. It didn't matter what writing stage you were at, because I was new. I had nothing published. I was very, very new to this. And people just were so wonderful. And I really, really loved going each Thursday morning to the different speakers that we would hear. And then I heard about this Turning Points, this anthology, and I sort of leapt right in and I said, okay, I'll be a part of it. If you'll have me, I'll be a part of this. And I wrote a story about my mother called The Coat. And it was something that I really cherish, because since I wrote the story, my mother since passed away, but she read the story and she really liked the story. In a way, it was like a gift to her, something that I could do and preserve in a different way than filmmaking. And so my journey is new as a writer. I've since published some short pieces in different journals, including Beyond Words and Arc 28 and Her Story. But Turning Points is my first official publication, and it's a book. As you were saying, we can hold it. It's like wonderful. I love turning the pages and reading everyone's story. So that's my story, and that's where I got here. And I really, really credit OCWW as being part of my initial journey. Now to you, Tom.
Okay. I look around at I'm going to take this off, sorry. I'll breathe over here. I look around at who's here, and I know there's plenty of people online as well, and recognize that we're all storytellers. That's how a human thinks. We think in terms of story. And whether we think in terms of fantasy or fanciful, or whether we hew closely to our own memories, we're all telling stories. The only difference is we're writing them down and trying to improve that writing and make it real for the readers. Even if that reader audience is very limited, we're trying to convey a reality to them. So in terms of myself, I view myself as primarily a novelist. But I began writing, as a teenager, short stories, on, that type of thing. But you earn a living, you have a family, life demands your time. Nonetheless, in '71, I took a correspondence course with the University of California. That took me a little ways. In '81, 10 years later, took a continuing education course at the University of Chicago on the style of the French writing that was common at that time, and that freed me up a bit. But what really got me to the point where I can be a writer today is my first publication was a game and associated historical articles with that game. And that taught me the persistence I needed to be able to write. But as people have already mentioned here, you need feedback as a writer. You need commentary from other folks. You need not simply the reader, but people reacting to what you're writing to be able to improve it. And to hear in OCWW, whether it's in the critique groups or in the actual Thursday morning sessions, like this morning's session where we were talking about reflection and how reflection changes from simply telling, you immediately begin thinking about your writing and saying, well, how do I apply that? How does that improve what I'm trying to do? And so whether the speaker is, the subject is poetry, whether it's an agent talking about the kinds of things that get published, whether it's a professor from Northwestern like Fred Schaefer, all of them are giving you lessons in terms of, if you're listening close and trying it out, on how to improve your writing. And what I love particularly is when they challenge us with an exercise in a session. And a lot of those exercises, they may have been just scribbles when we did them in the meeting, but I rework them and they become a short story or a flash fiction or something else that gets used in one of my novels. Della?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. My journey to writing has little bits and pieces of what everyone has said, but everyone, as we know, comes to it in their own way, in their own time. And yes, I was a reader before, and I don't remember being taught how to read, and I read the books in the library. My dad took me on his day off to the Belmont branch of the Chicago Public Library. And then I spent 30 years in a women's book group where we had kind of unusual rules: women authors only, paperback, and no repeating an author. When we read Barbara Kingsolver, great, but for all her books to follow, keep reading them on your own. Don't choose them for book group. So I felt like I had read so many amazing readers or authors. I could never be a writer, I thought, because the bar was too high. Then along a circuitous route from a 20-year tech career to being a teacher for a year to graduate school and education, I wrote a dissertation, and we talk about storytelling. I remember in graduates, I wrote a narrative dissertation, one woman's really teaching in a racist setting. And I realized I wanted to tell stories through writing myself. And I didn't find OCWW right away, but I did find other resources in the Chicago area. And I won a flash fiction contest in this Word of Art book, which I started to meld what I had started to pursue in graduate school late in life again, where I wrote Where I Am From for a journal on family methodologies, and but the real turning point for me, to say turning point, was I was at my Tai Chi class in the Ravenswood area, very close to where I went, and I had an idea, sort of like what Ronit just mentioned, that I wanted to write the story, the serendipitous story of how my parents met after World War II. My father was a returning GI. And all kinds of twists and turns, like a novel, for her 90th birthday, for her to enjoy as a gift. And she has since passed away herself. And I looked out of my Tai Chi studio and there was a closed door, lettered Story Studio. And I asked Elizabeth, our Tai Chi teacher, what's that? It sounds like a parable even in itself. And she said, oh, that's Jill's place, who I later learned was Jill Pollock. She used to do Tai Chi here too. You could take a class over there on any kind of writing. So I went there. I realized how much I didn't know about writing and how much there was to learn. And I wrote my first unpublished novel over the course of several years, a book called The Measure of a Teacher. But I returned to what I call the novel of my heart that Carrie mentioned has support from the Newberry Library and the City of Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, which I'm so grateful for that support. And it springs from family lore, but it is not a memoir. It is the first half of the 20th century. My father wrote down some things, an uneducated man, but a great storyteller himself. And so that's what brought me to writing. And when I found OCWW, all the things that Sarah, Ronit, and Tom have mentioned about deepening the craft and using speakers' critiques to make my work deeper, more, I feel like I've learned so much as a writer. So I'm very grateful for that, for our community. And one more thing I'll mention is critique groups. They have been instrumental in my progress. My first critique group came after a story studio class. The 6 of us looked at each other after workshopping and said, let's keep on meeting. We had gotten to know each other's work. And then also for the last 2.5 years, I've participated in a critique group with 3 other OCWW members writing very different things. And I learned from them and I learned from critiquing them as well. Paco, do you have a question? I don't know if...
Yeah, it's a question for all of you. Tell us the aha moment that you receive as feedback from your writing. The moment when you say, I didn't see that came from a critique group that you were involved in.
I have one. So Tracy Forge couple, hopefully I'm saying her name right. So she, on my piece, The Coat, she kept writing, what were you thinking? Or what were you feeling? She just kept pushing me to go deeper. And that was a great aha moment for not just that piece, but for everything else that I continue to write, to keep it so it's not surface level, so that I dig deep and I know what the characters are thinking and feeling. And that was a really great experience.
I'm a member of a critique group. There are 7 of us, of whom a couple of them are here in this room. And currently they're going through one of my novels called Acts. And it's fascinating to me, of the 6, they will each pick different elements of the story to either applaud or to suggest that needs some work. And it's never universal. It's always, each one has their take on it. And to me, that's especially valuable because you're really getting an audience reaction, not just an individual. I used to do the beta reader type of thing where it'd be a single voice coming back at me. And after a while, I sort of got used to that particular reader's bias, if you will. Now with the 6, I'm getting a much broader view of what I'm writing, and it really helps.
And to answer Paco's question of a more recent aha moment in my manuscript, during this revision, one of the members said, this is really Hannah's story, who's one of the matriarchs in the family who I'm writing about. And I woke up the next morning and said, I've got to rewrite it in her first person voice. That was like it was a major change. I've gone through many major changes and I'm still working on it. But that one acknowledgement from Karen. It made me like, oh, yes, of course, this is her story. So I've made some tweaks since then. Her daughter also comes to play the next generation in the first person, but that was something I really hadn't felt as deeply, like what Tom said, till that came.
And those, it's really hard to narrow down to one magnificent moment. But in the beginning, I've been with a critique group for about 8 years with mostly the same 10 to 12 people. And we've grown together and we've learned together. I think one of the things that was very instructive to me and an aha moment to me was, in spite of all my years of teaching literature to grades 4 through 12, I don't think until I became an active writer that I understood voice. And so we set it up. There were about 8 or 9 of us there that time. And we had a prompt and we all wrote to the prompt. But we didn't look at each other's papers. We spread out over the living room and the dining room, and we all wrote to that prompt. And then didn't sign it, didn't own up to the fact that it was ours. And then we got together and mixed up all of the papers. And then we had a wonderful time identifying who had written it. And I think after that exercise, voice was very clear to me. We, obviously, when you come and you're working on a work, and it's this topic that you've been on for months, then everybody knows you've written that. But this was not that. This was, out of practice. And it was wonderful because truly, regardless of what was written, you could tell the author's voice. And that lesson was very important for me because it gave it to me in the hands-on. And that would be my meaningful moment.
Yeah, I had a question. What happens, and I assume this has happened with all of you, when there's strong disagreement in your group? You decided to put Hannah in the first person, and somebody in your group decided, what a terrible mistake. I don't know, how do you handle conflict? I'm assuming there are differences of opinion, and how does that work out?
That's a great question. I love that. We've not ever had to put anyone out the door. And we have strong opinions. The one rule that stands before, during, and after a discussion is the final decision rests with the author. Regardless of how good some answers might be and how wonderful some changes might be indicated, the final decision rests with the author. And I have 10 years of working in this area, and I can faithfully say that's not solid agreement, but the author has the final decision.
I completely agree.
It's a great question.
Even the very best feedback from the best editor you might find, you may not accept because it is ultimately up to you, the author.
Right.
I would add also that while there may be some disagreement, particularly in the different styles that the different members use, nonetheless, all of them and yourself as well, all of the intent is simply to improve the work.
Yeah.
It's simply constructive criticism. Right. It isn't negative criticism in any way. And so regardless of whether you accept that criticism and adjust your piece, or whether you say, well, that's an opinion, but I'm going to stick with what I've got, it's all meant well-intentioned, and it's all constructive.
Yes, the groups that don't stay together don't have those kind of synergies. And that happens too. I mean, there are people who leave or groups split apart. I've seen it in the OCWW groups as well as others. Margot?
So in the process of writing your story and getting it down and revising it, at what point and for what reason do you think about the reader? Is it through the process, or is there a switch that goes on that you think not about what do I have to say, but what the reader needs to read?
That's another great question.
Well, I love what Fred Schaefer said in one of his lectures this September. He said, you know, it became popular to talk about reading like a writer when we read, you know, Sarah's book, How Is It Constructed, or, you know, but really he turned it on its head for the first time to say, it's not reading like a writer, it's writing like a reader. Writing like you're reading it fresh for the very first time. It's not so much you imposing your story on or what you have to say. I mean, there are things that are meaningful that you want to go to, but I think always thinking of the reader in many ways, but not writing for what you think the market will say or want, or you know, you have to, that's the passion that I think the others talked about as well, that we bring to the process.
I can only speak for myself in answer to that particular question. If there's a reader I write for, it's me. Maybe when I get to a subsequent draft or as I'm adjusting and later I start considering the broader view, and certainly, as I said, the critique group helps. But when you're getting that first draft down, you're writing really for that voice inside your own head. At least that's the case for me.
I think for me, accessibility is really important, whether it's in filmmaking or whether it's in writing. So I'm always thinking about, does this make sense to an audience? Is this clear enough for an audience? And would this, you know, if the character is walking across the street and then does it clear? Are they, like, if they're walking to a house and then they go across the street to a door, and I don't want the reader to ever be lost. But that's me whether I'm trying to reach a visual audience for filmmaking or audience that's reading. I want to be as clear as possible.
Yeah, today's speaker at OCWW emphasized that quite a bit, didn't she? Heather Sellers talked about locating in time and space to add intensity to your work. Paco?
Okay, so we have critique groups, and I think most of the writers here go to OCWW on a regular basis or attend the seminars. And is there a big influence on the critique group from the lessons that we learn in OCWW?
Can we ask for that one more time?
Well, I think it's an individualized response. I mean, as Tom said, you can only speak for yourself or for your own individual group. I don't know. People do talk about it when they've all attended the same speaker session. We definitely talk about it. We meet only every 3 weeks, my group, the OCWW group, so, you know.
Go ahead.
In my group, I tend to say, well, so-and-so said, so that's the word of God, so, you know, you should do it. No, I'm kidding. But, you know, that's it feels like there's a big influence of the teachings on the groups.
Yeah, we're always learning. That's one of the things.
Hi there. I'm going to adjust this here.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi, everybody. This is clearly an esteemed panel. There's a lot of publishing credits, there's documentary films, there's grants, there's middle grade novels, there's wonderful accomplishments that clearly we hold you all in high esteem and regard. And what I would say, and what my question would be, was that there are people here probably in this room and probably tuned in on Zoom who can't quite imagine themselves there and feel like it's sort of out of reach. And maybe it's imposter syndrome, or maybe it's dealing with a recent rejection. So my question is, will you please share with us a rejection of your own, as well as maybe how a writing community helped you build back from it?
Tom, do you want to take that?
I would say that if you're a writer who seeks publication, then you need to be inured to the fact that you'll get rejections. Early on, I was more of a poet writer than anything else, and submitted poetry hither and yon. And I have to tell you, none of my poetry has ever been published, and deservedly so. I am a prose writer, not a poet. And so, but I did experience stacks of rejections. However, that didn't deter me being a writer. That only meant that I needed to find where my voice, where my writing could be most effective. And that took decades. I'm not a natural. And I was taking the help of lots of different people in terms of reacting to my writing, but it has improved. And, I do have, this was the novel that was published traditionally, and then 6 years later, it was translated into Greek and published in Greece. And I really liked the royalties in euros. But anymore, I just publish online. I just give it away, basically. So it's sort of what you're after, what you want to be as a writer.
And Kelly, I've been rejected so many times. It's like, dust yourself off, pick yourself up, and submit again. I mean, I've submitted my first chapter for the first chapter contest of Works in Progress 5 years in a row to the Chicago Writers Association contest. And that's only one example. And 5 years in a row, it's rejected. So again, I have many, many more rejections. That's why the acceptances are so exciting and thrilling. But it's like also it's what we do. I feel that way now. It's late in life, and it's something I didn't imagine myself to be exactly, but once I found it, it's like, this is what I do. I'm in an online accountability group. It's 7 a.m., almost 7 days a week. And Lori knows that from another national online group, we go, to weekly historical fiction discussions. There's just, it becomes who you are. And I thought of a quote, I think maybe when Ronit was talking about storytelling is so integral to this, that when a First Nations author that I read his work, Thomas Martin, said, stories are all we are. That was like one of my favorite quotes of her. Stories are all we are. So anyway.
That's a great question, Kelly.
Yeah.
And the way that I look at it, because, when you get a rejection, the first thing that you think of is the reasons that you shouldn't have been rejected. But there is a time and a place for everything. And the badge of honor is the number of rejections that you get, because there's jokes that say, until you've got your 100th rejection, you're not a writer. You're not going to win the prize until you've got your 200th rejection. Well, there's all kinds of writers, there's all kinds of situations, and a rejection is a badge of honor. I swear it You can say you heard it here at the American Writers Museum on December 2nd.
But it hurts. Of course it does. You know, you put yourself out there, of course.
I'm part of I think it's the 100 Rejection Facebook group. I forget the name of it, but it's fantastic because there's writers down there that I really, really respect, and some get more than 100 rejections, and it's such a great community. So my advice is to reach out and be with other writers and join the 100 Rejection Facebook group, and together we get motivated.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, David Pelzer here.
Hi, David.
How are
I
you
can't
guys?
see with the light.
You're doing great, by the way. It's really great. I wanted to ask you guys, it's a writing question, and it goes back to, I think, Ronit's comment about what's the character feeling, what's the character thinking, and all of that. How do you guys go about digging deeper into your characters, okay? And a related question there is, do you ever dream about your characters, and do you ever take any advice that they give you?
I'm glad you brought my characters up. They were feeling left out because they know that they're the center of the pieces. I didn't believe at the beginning when I started this creative venture that said I'm going to dedicate time to it and I'm going to make something, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. I didn't believe it when I would get little hints from smart people, good writers, books that I'd read about writing that said, sometimes you have to realize that the story takes over, the characters take over, and it's almost like it magically writes itself. I said, woo, 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 no, I'm a realist. I've got my feet on the ground. I'm not going there. Especially in my children's novel, Olivia, Jenny, and Branch wrote some of that novel because they would not leave me alone. Now that sounds weird, and yes, it's weird, but I am a gal with her feet on the ground. Branch wasn't in the novel to begin with. This is a brother and a sister. Branch is the younger, annoying brother. He wasn't even in the novel until I got to maybe the 5th or 6th chapter. And all of a sudden there was this little voice and said, put me in, put me in, put me in. Now, whether you call that inspiration, imagination, or crazy, I don't care what it is. But Branch is in that novel because he needed to be in that novel. He made it better. And yeah, that sounds a little guru, and I'm obviously, livening it up a little bit. But there's something that happens in the creative process. Having taught every grade level from pre-K, where I was misplaced, but from pre-K up to 12th grade, the one thing that I taught every child and really focused on was believing in their ability to try or do anything that they wanted to do. And that's something that should never be killed, but sometimes it's not engendered in the home, sometimes it's not engendered in the community. But the level and amount of creativity that I have seen in children, and then that translates all the way up to adults, there is stuff that goes on that we do not understand. But if you kill it at an early age, or if you diminish the arts and education that I had to fight for a lot of time, if you diminish that, you are taking out the side that keeps us alive, keeps us with hope, and keeps us going. So the creativity comes. And it's important for us as parents and teachers and adults and writers and readers to keep it flowing. Every one of us is writing differently. Take a look at the size of my book and then take a look at the size of Tom's books over there. I write what I can write, and I write it fairly well. I wouldn't even attempt to do that. Sorry, Tom. But this in its own way has its own merit. And since we are different, we can all do it. So I'm here to keep hope alive.
I guess I would say that I almost always start a novel anymore with a character list. I think about situations and there may be some inspiration. For example, we took a trip to Tampa, and that led to a novel called Tampa Bay. And when I was walking around, I saw someone had a shingle out for their job, which was being a mediator. Well, the character in that Tampa Bay novel is a mediator. However, I do have to say that when I was in the midst of this 5-year tome, I sort of stopped midpoint. And I did have Philip of Macedon, who this is the character in this particular novel, come to me in my dreams and say, "Get to it, I want my story told."
Awesome.
So I have a couple of questions from the audience online. So I'm going to just read a couple of them. The first one I'm going to ask is from our friend Don Evans, who wants to know, what is your responsibility as a critic in terms of your ability to identify and articulate ways to support your peers?
Would you say the first part about
Sure.
that again?
So what is your responsibility as a critic in your workshop in terms of your ability to identify and articulate ways to support your peers?
Well, Don is one of my, a teacher that gave me inspiration to write this novel from a story. So I listened to that question very carefully. And I feel like the camaraderie among a critique group, it's like if everyone says everything is fine, you're not being helpful. So I think that's what he's getting at, that not to just, but to be honest. And as you meet more frequently, we have not missed a 3-week week from in-person and then later to Zoom for 2.5 years. You really know the characters, the story, and I think our responsibility is to be honest based on the accumulated knowledge of what we know. And then, as what was said earlier, it's up to the author whether they're going to agree with that or not. But it sort of becomes like my 30-year book group. When you get to know the other 6 people really well, you kind of know when Jill says something, you might really listen carefully. But maybe when Catherine does, you kind of don't take it so well. I mean, you really get to know what fits with your work and who gets your work the most. I mean, that's what I've found. Yeah.
Good answer. I think it's in the phrasing of your comment to the person that's really important. Instead of saying, "You left this out," you start with an I statement and you say, "I need to know this," rather than "this is missing, but I need to know this." So the minute you take it around and put it on yourself, then you're cotton padding the remarks. And, there have been times where sometimes there's not a good fit in a critique group. And if there's not a good fit, then changes need to be made, or you need to go over, how people are feeling, and you do it in a gentle way. Any community group of any type, there's got to be some unevenness. But if you take it and you make it an I statement, I think that helps a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I was always taught to ask things as a question rather than a statement. So, why did the character do that? Or, can you tell me a bit more about the setting? And I find that really helps too, to depersonalize what you're talking about.
Good point.
I think they've already summed it up, but I would agree with the statements. Again, what you're trying to do is be as constructive as possible. And if you feel that something is flawed in terms of conveying what the author meant to convey, you point that out. You be as honest as you can about that. When you're in a critique group for years, and ours has been going on for 3 years now, you do get a sense of what each author is trying to accomplish with their respective work. And so you're really trying to move in that direction with them by pointing out where there's an opportunity to make it clearer, to accomplish what they want to accomplish.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask another one from online. Fred Fitzsimmons has asked, if I am exclusively a short story writer or novelist, and your weekly workshop covers a broad array of topics of writing, topics like poetry, creative nonfiction, etc., of what benefit is it to me to attend instructional sessions on types of writing that I'm not working on?
As I tried to convey earlier, you get a nugget from everyone. It doesn't really matter. It could even be a non-writer, an agent, or someone who's there. But you learn from everyone some aspect of writing, and it will feed into how you use it in your writing. So if it's a nonfiction piece or a memoir or something of that sort that is being talked about by the presenter, that doesn't mean it doesn't have validity for me as a novelist and short story writer. It certainly does, because it's still a matter of how you convey information and storytelling and make it alive for your audience.
And just a final question from the online group. There have been a couple of questions on the same topic, which is, and some of you have mentioned other groups. I think people are wondering, what's the best way to find a writer's workshop or a writing group? And are there ones that you know of that might be low cost or good entry points for people who are looking to do this for the first time?
Go ahead, Della.
Well, I consider what I've done these last 7 years since I walked across the hall of the Story Studio a do-it-yourself MFA. I had enough degrees. I was not going back to school, but I knew I didn't know anything about writing when I wrote that story for my mother, not really. And so I have gone to the Iowa Summer Writers Festival, and taken courses, and I met people there who live in Wisconsin, who are on the board of the Chicago Writers Association, which has a wonderful conference. Before, when we could go to in-person conferences, I would try that. Through that woman in Milwaukee, I asked her about small publishers and all that, and she told me about, well, Della, you've got to know about the Women's Fiction Writers Association, which is a nationwide group, and it's some of the people I tune into every morning for my accountability group. So I find, I don't know how to say where to find it. To me, local is really best. I know New York has amazing resources and others, LA and San Francisco, but as Ronit said, when you find a group like OCWW, and Sarah and Tom said too, it was so welcoming, and there was such a wealth of information, and it wasn't, if something fits. I invited someone from an online class I took at Iowa Summer Writers Fiction group festival last month, and she came to the session today. I said, be my guest. She lives in Ames, Iowa, and she doesn't have many resources there. And she's like, I think I'm going to join this group. They seem like wonderful people. So what do you say? When you find a group, you just have to go for it.
I would add that, make a plug here for public libraries.
Oh, yeah, of course.
there's no public library that I'm aware of that doesn't have book clubs associated with it. There might well be, through those book clubs, people who are willing to and interested in forming critique groups as well. I know Wilmette, for example, has a writers association. Do they meet at the library? Maybe. Yeah. And so if you want free, start with your public library. And I say that even though I am a library board member at Winnetka. So that's a great resource for connecting with people whose interests are in writing and in reading.
I agree.
Good point.
Yeah.
I wanted to make a comment as a critic a little bit. Many of you may have listened to the Tuesday podcast from the New York Times when they talked about the 10 best books of 2021. And they talked about criteria, how do they decide what's a best book? And it's, did the writer accomplish what they set out to accomplish? Is it within the parameters of the writer's creation? And how successful they were is what makes a great book. And I think that's really important, when you're in a group, to respect, the writer's mission, because you may have a different mission, but that doesn't matter. And I was going to say, when I first read Della's PhD dissertation, and it was a narrative, and I thought to myself, who cares about this woman? Really, this teacher? How is that important? But I said, you know what? I'm going to read it with an open mind. And I came to understand why that story was important for teachers and for the scholarship of pedagogy. But I had to, sort of flick a switch in my head that just having lots of footnotes from thousands of historical sources was not the only way to write a dissertation.
You're too academic. That's that's where I found my home as a creative writer, because I kept turning to writing, co-authoring articles with teachers to let their voices emerge, and that's not usually part of the hierarchy of our university system, but.
I'd like to ask one more question from online, and maybe ask that each of you respond to it a little bit and think about what you might want to tell everyone about what you're working on now, as we are approaching the end of the evening already. And it's been a wonderful session, and I think everybody has enjoyed themselves greatly. But the question is, since you are all now accomplished authors, and it's obvious that the Off-Campus Writers Workshop has been a great benefit to you, does OCWW also have members that are rookie writers, and how do they benefit from what that organization has to offer?
No, I mean, I'm a rookie writer. I hadn't had anything published when I started with OCWW, which was 2 years ago. They welcomed me with open arms. I still see myself as a rookie writer, and so it's a wonderful organization for newbies as well as accomplished writers.
And I would add, I don't feel, with tons of credentials really in this area either. And this year there's purposefully part of Susan Levi's programs, along with Renee James, to have core courses that are going to help in creation of short stories. Because guess what? Turning Points isn't our last anthology. There's one plan to begin in January to be published in 2023, and they're going to call it Meaningful Conflicts, and it include poetry this time. So some of these core courses, and Turning Points as well, because of the nature of small groups then going up to the editors, was designed to take all levels of writers who just wanted to participate in this grand experiment, really, not really even an experiment. There's a vision among several people who made it happen, so.
So, do you all have any final thoughts that you would like to add to the audience about what you're writing or what you're working on, and how this Writers Workshop helps you?
I'll tackle that first. Going back to my bucket imagery and getting inspiration. If you figure that I've been doing this for 10 years and associated with OCWW for 10 years, and there's at least 40 workshops a year, I've attended at least half of those in a year, and some years it's 40 workshops. So you take 10 times 40, that's 400 workshops. Where would I get that? You don't get that in an MFA course. It's an unbelievable opportunity to have everything in that one bucket that you then splash all over your writing pages and your brain each week, and it is refilling your inspiration, your camaraderie, your community, your talents, your skills, your craft. It's really never ending. And it's not just OCWW. There are workshops all over the Chicago area, as we've mentioned some of them in particular. There's so much, it's never ending. You will never learn the whole thing, but it's amazing what you get from it. And sometimes I've said I should be home writing. I should be writing that next book. But if I don't go out and refill my inspiration, that next book is not going to occur. Halfway through each one of the Thursday workshops, we stop, we take a break, and it's brag time. And anybody raises their hand on screen, because we're on Zoom, of course, and they get to say what they've had published, what's been happening, what's coming out. It's wonderful. And even though you may be a newbie, because I was a newbie, I was a total newbie, I was a wannabe, I could not write the word writer after my name. I could not do it. I could write teacher, master's, principal. I could write all of those identified and certified things. I could not on LinkedIn put my name in as a writer. I felt it's called the Imposter Syndrome, because you think you have not been anointed. Well, the pain and the tears have anointed me. Okay, I can now put writer there. But you're refilling your inspiration with like comrades, and knowing that we're all at different levels, and there's no A student and there's no F student, but that we are constantly investing the time and the energy to get something out of it and to share it with everyone else. It's a very, very warm community. So I encourage it.
And to answer the question of what we're working on now, I am working on what I call the third revision, although some chapters and sections many, many more times. And I'm down to the last maybe 60 pages, and then feel like this might be as close to what I can take it as. But I don't know if it's the imposter syndrome or feeling like it's not good enough yet, but I have made significant changes during this 2021 year, taking it from a first draft at the end of the year to now what I'm calling a third draft. And I have an idea of what to do for 2022, but it may, involve yet another revision, depending on a couple things before I really, I like Sarah, I'm determined to get this published. So one way or another, I'm gonna get, if I come back here or when I go to the public library, I'll hand them a book and say, put this on your shelf.
Tom, Ronit?
Sure. In terms of what I'm working on, so I went to Story Studio and I took Memoir in a Year class with Nadine Kenny Johnstone, and that was fantastic. But what it made me realize is I didn't necessarily want to write a memoir, but I wanted to write short, creative nonfiction essays. And in the past year and a half, my life's taken a turn because I was in Israel. My parents were very ill with cancer and they since passed away. So I've been writing a lot about that experience and about grief and grieving, and I'm right thick in the middle of it. And my critique group that I have, it's an international critique group with Israelis and Americans, and it's through Zoom. It's really cool. And OCWW, they're just invaluable community resources to help me write, continue writing, meeting people, learning from reading other people's work. And so what I will be doing in the future is taking everything that I've been writing for the past year and a half and putting it in some sort of essay format. I don't really know what it's going to look like, and I think that that's okay because it's first draft and it could look totally different by the time I'm finished. But that's what I'm doing right now.
I have sort of two sources of writing. I write in the morning on novels, and then I take some time in the afternoon to write for my weekly blog, which is usually a flash fiction or a pair of them. So my current novel, this will be the 23rd, is called Panther County. And it's sort of a crime novel, I guess, at this stage. Where it will evolve to by the time I'm done, who knows. But for example, the afternoon, years ago, my one daughter gave me a book called 642 Things to Write About. And I'm at 227 right now. So those are the prompts that I use to write some flash fictions or short stories. And the one written today, for example, it's supposed to be a vivid childhood memory from a child's viewpoint. So I borrowed actually from my aunt who was burned as a child, and so I wrote a story about a burn. Now, I would like to add, though, something. If you want to be a writer, or if you are a writer, it requires a certain kind of discipline. You have to write. It doesn't get done unless you write. And you have to write practically every day. It doesn't have to be very long. It can be a half hour, it can be 45 minutes, but you have to do it. You can't just wish for it. And the other aspect of that is you have to read. And you have to read widely, different genres, poetry, essays, fiction. You have to read. And one of the values of OCWW, we've talked about it in terms of adding a review of our own writing, but it also means I've improved my reading. Because now, a lot of times when I'm reading, I'm thinking about some of the lessons I've learned in OCWW and how that author handled it, or didn't handle it, as the case may be. So those are my thoughts on it.
I think this would be the opportune time on that note to say thank you to our panelists, and we give them a round of applause. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight for this wonderful discussion. Thank you to everybody online. We hope you enjoyed, and we wish you all a wonderful night and continued great writing. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.